So thank you very much. So getting underway. This is the Durable Learning Series. I'm Dr. Peter Hornifer. I'm the Executive Dean at the All-American Institute of Medical Sciences in Jamaica, and I serve as Director of Medical Education for Lecturio. My clinical background is that as a cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm based in Maryland and still have some oversight responsibilities, but most of my efforts are focused in the educational arena. I always want to give special thanks to the learning science team at Lecturio that helps research and present much of the materials that we produce. And without them, we really couldn't put this forward. But I wanted to add also special thanks today to the broader team at Lecturio, and thank Lecturio corporately for sponsoring this event. In particular, at this time with the war in Ukraine, many of my Lecturio colleagues have family, and I know it affects the whole world, but it's been so impressive to see how the team at Lecturio has closed ranks as many members have obviously gone and focused their attentions on loved ones and family in the Ukraine, and the others have come together brilliantly to keep presentations like this and really all operations at Lecturio going. So thanks, and in our hearts, those of us that aren't as close to the conflict, are really hoping that the conflict is resolved peacefully and soon. To go over the construct of this seminar series, the premise is really to look at the evidence and what's been found from cognitive science and neuroscience, and how that informs instructional design and learning strategies, and with the ultimate goal of making learning durable. It's one thing if you learn something briefly and you can't retain it, but both for students taking exams that they, summative exams they need to retrieve, and most importantly, clinically, there are times where you just can't look it up. You need to know it, and that's the key to learning things in a retrievable fashion. So today we're going to focus on metacognition. And I've entitled it, "Do You Really Know What You Think You Know?" And to me, as I see my students at Ames, and some of the big struggles are, that they say they thought they know it, they knew it for the exam or in the clerkships, but they really don't. And so we're going to focus on what can be done to help them gain a better recognition of what they do and don't know. And this is the term encompassed by metacognition. We'll define shortly. The learning outcomes for this seminar are listed here to be able to define metacognition, recognize the roles and possibilities that it has to relate to teaching practices, and to integrate technology. As we have a guest speaker today, I've decided to keep the review of the concept relatively brief. You all hopefully have received the article and have read it. And so the outcomes are really based on, in part, this presentation, but I encourage anybody that did not have time to go through the article to go through and read it and keep it as a reference. So let's start by defining metacognition. And most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the term. It refers to thinking about cognition, or thinking, and thus the knowledge, monitoring, and evaluation of one's thinking. And you can look at it sort of in the medical education context, that there is the cognitive processes, what we've been talking about in many of these seminars, how, the act of actually retaining and acquiring knowledge of conditions or anatomy or basic sciences. And metacognition is really the process of knowing when and how and to apply these strategies. And do you really know what you think you know? Are your cognitive strategies being effective? And so you can know all the cognitive strategies that we've reviewed, but you don't know, if you don't know how to apply them, whether to apply them, and have you applied them effectively, then you won't be effective in learning. So we have another poll, and like to see how many of you actually address the concept of metacognition for your students. Is the poll up, Sarah? Oh, there we go. So, and it's just a very quick answer. And I want to preface, we'll find out a little later in this call that teaching is important, but is not the whole answer. So that'll be addressed a little further on in the seminar. And roughly 50% don't at all. And that, to me, is not at all surprising. Actually, I am pleasantly surprised by the 15 or so % that do teach about metacognition. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results just so you can all see. So about half do not at all, about 40% sometimes, and 15% often. So let's just briefly review metacognition. And this is, I think, well visualized in this slide, where we know, and we've talked in previous seminars, how there are learning habits that many students use that make them feel ready. And there are things that we know from evidence that shouldn't be used, but leave you with a sensation that you are ready for your exam, you're ready to practice. There's things like cramming and rewatching videos and excessive highlighting. We also know that the evidence-based strategies can in some ways make you feel equally ready, but often our students may not, may have more doubts about their preparedness, but come away, if they're using these processes, they know that they work and will still have confidence. Now, one of the studies and the contributions to metacognition that I find so insightful were described by two psychologists, Dunning and Kruger, in the late 90s. Many of you have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and what I love about it is it describes what has been termed Mount Stupid. And the essence of this is that as you start to learn, your confidence increases rapidly and often exceeds your true understanding of the concept. So by analogy, when we're looking at our ineffective study strategies, you may gain great confidence and think you know the material, but you really don't. And unfortunately, the students, then come back and get a lousy exam grade and have to go back. And so they have been at the peak of Mount Stupid, and then they come back. And I think all of us professionally, as we learn, realize that sometimes we thought we knew things that we didn't. And I think this is a very important point. Furthermore, there's evidence of this being a clinical problem as well worldwide now. And this Dunning-Kruger effect, or being on Mount Stupid, has been attributed to vaccine hesitancy, especially in developed countries where Many people who have access to some information will think that they're educated on the safety and efficacy of vaccines and decide by themselves, even though they're not medical or scientific experts, that vaccines either aren't effective and aren't safe, and decide on their own not to take them. The other important point to note, if any of you had joined us for Barbara Oakley's talk in the neuroscientific implications of learning, that many very bright people actually have more difficulty in recognizing what they do and don't know. And you can be very intelligent and find yourself in Mount Stupid. So with that in mind, I think this is a very important part of the whole metacognitive process. So as we briefly review the evidence, as we always like to in these sessions, there is clear evidence from cognitive science that students with better metacognition can focus better on mastery learning, have higher motivation, and do perform better. That explicit instruction on metacognition and metacognitive skills positively affects critical thinking and diagnostic accuracy and can reduce diagnostic errors. And this is a fact not only applicable to learning your basic sciences, but when you're in the clinical setting creating differential diagnoses, you have to ask yourself, is there something else I haven't thought of, and really evaluate the whole thinking process. From the neuroscientific perspective, there is clear evidence that the metacognitive processes are very important, and so much so that they have their own area of the brain. The frontal cortex is in many ways the central executive, where many of the metacognitive processes are located. That many of the habits that we talk about, poor planning, little sleep, we know now at the neurobiological level how they affect or adversely affect learning, and that sleep deprivation hinders neuroplasticity and consolidation, that stress or excessive stress can affect the neurochemical process that affects the linkage of axons and dendrites. A certain degree of stress actually can be positive, but excessive stress can be very negative. And lastly, the transient storage capabilities of short-term memory, often located in the hippocampus, we've spoken about before, how they can make you feel as if you know something, but that learning is really quite transient and you can't retrieve it when you need to. So I would like to say that as I was planning this talk, I thought that I better apply some of these metacognitive principles. And I'm always worried about finding myself on Mount Stupid. And I realized that even though I may know some things about metacognition, there was no way that I was going to know as much about metacognition as our guest speaker today. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Folkestad, who is professor and university distinguished teaching scholar from the Colorado State University, and also the School of Education, the Center of Analytics and Learning and Teaching. He has a particular interest in using technology to enhance learning and training and innovative practice. And he's done some really exciting research that he's going to share with us today. And when I heard about this, I thought this would just be perfect to share, because it puts into practice how we can bring things like metacognition to life, and created a program that he calls U Behavior. And we'll focus on how we can support metacognition or metacognitive practices and achieve durable learning. Before I turn this over to him, I want to remind everyone that, as we did in the last session, we'd like you all to bring up, you can scan the QR code and pull this, that's called a Padlet. It's basically just a chat device. But what this allows us to do is to take your comments, your suggestions, and your input. And we will synthesize this and send it back to everyone at the end of the session, or in reality next week sometime. So, and I think, is it in the chat as well? Do we have the link to the Padlet? I think should be at the bottom. So with that, I'm going to turn this over, and then you'll be able, when Dr. Folkestad's done, you'll be able to, we'll move everybody into discussion groups as we have before, and you can keep the Padlet with you and continue to put your questions and thoughts and ideas in the discussion group. So with that, thank you so much for joining this talk, and I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for the intro and giving me the platform to present some of my research that I've been working on in regards to metacognition. Everybody seeing the full screen, Peter?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, looks great.
All right. So just to start off, I wanted to just give you an overview to the research I'm doing, but we really started in undergraduate curriculum at CSU within my lab to look at the metacognitive conundrum that Peter was talking about, where students come into things overly confident, and they do a number of things, which just struck me as Peter was talking. But one thing that is a challenge that we found, and is really where we started our research, was that students are rarely taught these strategies, these metacognitive strategies, and they're rarely taught about them. But on top of that, they're rarely coached in them. So there's been a number of research studies that have been done in the cognitive sciences that look at students' awareness, and a lot of students are somewhat aware of these strategies, and they've been taught something about them, but they rarely put them into practice, and that's really where we started. The other thing that I wanted to point out real quick, just to frame off of what Peter was talking about, is that I think we frequently bring students to the peak of Mount Stupid in our classes, and we do that through the pedagogy that we use, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I move along. But the pedagogy we use, where we expect students to regurgitate tons of content in comprehensive final exams, and then we tell them that they've learned it or they've succeeded in the class, and I think that's just setting them up to feel like they've learned something, but it's not extremely durable, not extremely durable learning. So with that said, Peter talked briefly, just pointed out that this is about U behavior. U behavior is a methodology that we developed at Colorado State University to coach students in metacognition and those behaviors. And so the objectives for today are really to get you to understand a little bit about U behavior and how it connects to metacognition, understand how U behavior has been set up to teach and coach these methods of metacognition, and then identify how some of the existing findings support the method. So we'll go through the findings and talk about those. Peter's talked about metacognition, but how does it relate to durable learning? So if one is aware of their thought processes and patterns, I mentioned it before, but they've realized that only does so much. What we really need students to do is not just to understand that these things can be beneficial, but to put them into practice. And a lot of research shows that students do not do that, including the research that I'll present today around U behavior. So let's just briefly talk about durable learning. What is durable learning? It's acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory so that you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. So this durable learning thing goes beyond the normal semester-long course. And we want to retain information for longer periods of time. And if we want to do that, we need to be aware of our practice patterns. We need to be aware of the metacognitive practice patterns that we're involved in, so that we can hold on to that content longer term. So, I always say that durable learning is learning to me. I don't know if I teach a class and a student walks out of there and they forget 80 to 90% of it, I'm not sure I really taught them anything, or I didn't set up an environment that allowed for durable learning. So what we're trying to do is get students to hold on to critical content for longer periods of time. So to learn, what do we need to be aware of? We should be aware of how and when we engage in our thinking, or when we practice various things. We know that a number of things are foundational, absolutely foundational, if we want to see durable learning. One is we need to be testing ourselves, retrieving information from our brains. That is critical. We need to be doing that not just once or on one day for specific content, but we need to be doing it across time. So we need to space what's called spacing. We need to space out our practice. And then the other thing that we focused in on in U behavior was really getting students to think about mixing up the practice between concepts. And that's a concept called interleaving. And a lot of you, I know, are aware of these things. So U behavior was targeted at these specific sort of hows, how you would practice, and seeing if we could get students to be aware of them, but then engage in them. So what are students doing? So we know that students do a number of things, and I'm going to show you some examples from the data that we gathered when we put practice activities in front of students. But just naturally, students like to reread. They like to put together flashcards, study cards. They also like to highlight. And we know that these types of behaviors are not optimal when it comes to getting students to hold on or retain information longer, or for durable learning. Now, with that said, we do know that there are certain students who put together flashcards and they practice them across time and they mix up their practice, but it's pretty typical that students don't do that. For a number of reasons. Maybe they don't know about it. It's a harder strategy for learning. It takes more discipline, and also everyone knows. Most of us here on this presentation today know that you can cram and get through a final exam pretty easily. That's a beneficial strategy for that, but it's not beneficial for durable learning. So what are instructors doing? A lot of instructors are trying to figure out ways to leverage and get some of these metacognitive strategies and practice activities into their classrooms. I've seen mixed results on these things. They might have students answer in a large lecture hall questions on their computer. They have clickers, and they might have students answering questions in class using the clickers. Those strategies can be good. But it depends on how they're utilizing them, I would argue. So are they getting students to practice things over time, across multiple days, potentially within the classroom, or are they just testing them on the content for that particular week? Just to back up a second here, the other thing that faculty members are doing, and they have developed all sorts of quiz questions in their learning management systems. At CSU, Colorado State University, we use Canvas as our learning management system. So this is kind of where my research took off. There are a lot of faculty members putting together these quizzes online and asking students to practice. They really wanted them to practice across time, to practice the content multiple times across the entire semester. And so that seems like a really intriguing strategy. And that's kind of where we started. And we started to look at the data underneath the learning management system. And that's what I'll present today. So we gathered every timestamp when students were using the quizzes, when they took those quizzes, and how frequently they took them. And we started to look at that data to understand their practice behavior, to get an idea of if they were engaging and taking these metacognitive ideas and putting them into practice. So what does the data say? Let's look at some basic questions as we move through this. So what happens when, as I discussed, what happens when students are given practice quizzes? So again, faculty members put these quizzes online. They say, practice these things, practice them more than once. And what happens? All right, so we're going to plot these out. Basically, their score on the left-hand side on the bottom scale is just a timeline. And what we've found, this is fascinating, what we have found is that students practice one particular practice activity multiple times until they end up essentially getting a good score or a high score on that practice activity. And then they go on to the next one, and the next one. Basically, when they're available or when they're due, and they practice them until they get the high score across the entire semester. And this is what their practice behavior looks like. Now, I want to point out that this practice behavior is not extremely optimal, because we know from the research that again, spacing out their practice across time for each of the concepts is more beneficial. Okay, retrieving stuff from their head, practicing this and testing themselves, and spacing out is more beneficial, and also interleaving is beneficial. And you can see that both of those are missing in this type of practice. So if you just give your students quizzes and you say practice, then this is the behavior that we see. About 80 to 90% of the students will engage in this. And I'll just expand on that a little bit. What's really interesting is that we engage students in a psychology 142 class at our university, which is a basic intro to these particular concepts. So cognition, metacognition, learning practice behaviors, that is the core of the course. So those students are getting that core knowledge, that's what they're learning. And when we looked at their practice behavior with the quizzes, we saw this exact same behavior. So knowing about these behaviors, even in an extensive semester-long course, students still masked their practice, as you see here on the screen, repeated their practice of the quizzes over and over again until they got the high score, and then they never came back to them. So that was really fascinating to us. When we started to unveil sort of the actual practice behavior with these practice quizzes, this is what we saw. So we asked ourselves, what can we do to change the behavior? That's where we were. We really wanted students to change their behaviors, to actually put these practices, these metacognitive practices, into effect. So what we did was we designed this U-behavior method. We give them a 10-minute tutorial. So that's over here on the left-hand side. We give them a 10-minute tutorial to
I think you've muted yourself somehow.
Something, yeah.
Yeah. Am I good now? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
I was just unmuted for just a second there because I got a note. So give them a 10-minute tutorial that explains to them these behaviors and the benefits for their durable learning. Okay. It also explains to them the U-behavior process, which I'm going to explain to you here. Explains that, and it gets them coached up to engage in these practice behaviors. So it gives them that, we give them that 10-minute tutorial, it explains it. And then throughout the semester, we give them the quizzes. These are the same quizzes that they had access to before. It's just that we're coaching them up on these behaviors. So they get access to those particular quizzes. We call them retrieval practice activities because we're trying to get students to think of them as practice. And we're trying to get them to think about it as retrieval, getting stuff out of their brains. So we give them those quizzes. They can practice them across the entire semester. And we also give them 2 reflections during the semester. So we give them some time to reflect. we ask them, how do they think their behavior is going? And then we ask them, what's their plan? Do they plan to change their behavior in the future? So we give them that 2 times during the semester. And then we give them a rubric, and this rubric is explained in the tutorial at the beginning of the class, and we tell them that they're not going to get points for just taking the quizzes. They're going to get points for their practice behavior, all right? And because we have the data, we can generate scores, basically some measures that indicate how they practice. So we have a score for spacing out their practice across time for each of the quizzes, and we have a score for interleaving the practice, so mixing up the practice between the quizzes. And that's what this rubric is. At the end of the semester, they basically end up getting points for reflecting on their behavior, engaging in behaviors, the 2 main behaviors, which are spacing and mixing, throughout the entire semester. And this is the rubric that we give them, and then it's the rubric that we use to grade them on their final practice behavior. So just to set this up a little bit more, originally they got graded, just to recap, originally they got graded on how that if they get the high score on the quiz, they get those points, and they earn points for all the different quizzes. In our method, we're putting all the emphasis and all those points that they used to get for getting the high score on the practice behavior. So we're shifting the measure considerably in order to get them to first of all realize that we're serious about them engaging in these behaviors, because they're extremely beneficial for durable learning, and also we're serious about them engaging and changing their behavior. Okay, so let's talk about some of the results. So we set up, it was really interesting because we had a microbiology course that was on board for running experiments, and it happened during COVID. So all the students were online, and it allowed us to do a really nice experiment where we set up 2 conditions, and we randomly assigned conditions to students. And we had a total of about 217 students that volunteered to be in the study. And there were these two conditions that we set up. So the first condition was the traditional method. It's called low stakes quizzing. I described it already. They get to keep the score, the high score for the quiz. The second condition was the U behavior condition or method that I sort of ran you through there. So students are randomly assigned to this, and we wanted to see, basically, did they change their behavior? Did the U behavior method change their behavior? And then we wanted to see what happened with performance. So low stakes quizzing. I'm just going to run through this visually here, and then we'll look at some numbers. But when we ran the low stakes quizzing experiment, or we looked at the condition where the students were in the low stakes quizzing, unsurprisingly, we saw the same thing. About 80 to 90% of the students masked their practice. They repeated the practice for each of these quizzes until they got the high score, and then they stopped out. So that wasn't a surprise, because we'd seen that before repeatedly over and over again. In the U behavior condition, we saw a significant change, a statistically significant change in behaviors. Okay, so we got a significant number of students to change their behaviors, and they looked something like this. So they would take the retrieval practice activity number 1 on day, I don't know, 2 or 3, whatever that is, and then they would go on to 2, and then they would come back to 1 later on in the semester. That might be like week 2, go to 3, come back to 2. Okay, you can see that this is different practice behavior, right? This is exciting. And it's not trivial to get people to change their behavior. So we were pretty thrilled with this. And we knew theoretically that this type of behavior should change performance. We should see some changes in performance, which I'll talk about here in a second. So statistically significant change in behaviors. The Cohen's d effect size on this was about 1.2, which is super large in the social sciences. It's a big effect, okay? Just to put some nuance on this, we didn't get all students to change their behavior, okay? But we got about 55% of the students, somewhere around there, about 55% of the students to change their behavior. So their behavior looked something like this, okay? That was a big deal, right? We still have work to do. We still have more students. We're trying to figure out why they didn't change their behavior. We still have work to do, but this is encouraging, okay? And it's significant, and the effect is quite large. So what about performance? Here's the classic descriptive and t-test table here, but between groups experiment. So when we looked at highly effective behaviors, students who engage in highly effective behaviors, we can see the differences in means here. So there was a difference in means. So those who practiced and used the U behavior methods and changed their behavior, their mean was higher on the retention test. So this is retention test. I can also talk about comprehensive final exam, but retention test was 5 weeks after the semester ended. Okay, we tested them again to see how much of the information they retained, and we saw this type of difference. It's significantly different, and the Cohen's effect size, the effect size between the groups was up about 0.65, which is great, okay, because that aligns with a lot of the cognitive science research on these types of behaviors. And the reason I say it's great is because that effect size is not extremely smaller than what we would expect when people change their behavior in this way. And it's not extremely large, okay? So it's right in line with what they're seeing in the sort of the bench sciences on these types of behaviors. So we were really happy with this. We also saw, just to mention, we also saw boost in learning on the comprehensive final exams. That was also significantly different, and the effect size was not as large, which is to be expected because students can cram for the final exam, right? But it was still significant. Now, this effect size, just so you know, is about a letter grade difference in performance if you want to look at it that way. Okay, so what can we conclude? We can conclude that behaviors impact this idea of durable learning and students' durable learning. Their ability to retain information and to recall it on a true retention test 5 weeks after a class ends. And, you know, the other thing that's really interesting that I like to talk about in conclusions is that the pedagogy significantly, the thing you're doing in your class, the pedagogy significantly impacts behavior. If we give them low stakes quizzing methodology, sometimes we think, oh, this is a good idea. And then we look at what they're actually doing with it, our students, and it's the behaviors that we don't want them to do. They're massing that practice until they get the score on the quiz, the high score on the quiz, and then they never return to it. So any pedagogy we put into play is going to have some impact on behavior, which is going to have some impact on this idea of durable learning, right? We need to design interventions with this at the forefront, this idea, right? Like, okay, we're going to put this in play, this methodology, this teaching methodology, what impact is it going to have on their behaviors and their awareness of their metacognitions and how they put it into practice themselves. So I argue, and I keep pushing on this, that we need to always find ways to witness their behaviors. We did that through the data in our learning management system, but there's a lot of different methods for potentially doing this. But actually seeing student behavior was critical and key as we sort of walk through this these experiments and built out the behavior pedagogy, and then learned. That data was really critical for exposing that to us and allowing us to improve that pedagogy across time. And like I said, we still have work to do there, right? We got about, like I said, 55% or somewhere around there, 55% of the students change their behavior in significant ways, but we still have some things to learn. Why don't the other that other group of students change their behaviors? What's going on there? What influences that? It's really fascinating to think about sort of that more qualitative information, how we're going to gather that, and what that can mean.
So welcome back, everyone. And, I was going from room to room, and it was really tough leading rooms because there were great questions being asked. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating topics and most crucial to learning. I'm going to share my screen again just to wrap up here. And then because we really always try hard to keep to the time, everyone has other responsibilities, and want to thank everybody for taking time to participate. But boy, I think we could have spent an hour in discussions, and our series will be ongoing. Just to wrap up as a summary, we know that metacognitive skills are crucial to effective learning, that these skills are not intuitive or widely practiced, need to be taught, monitored, and most important, what we've learned today is also encouraged. You need to build this into your system, and that technology can play a crucial role in facilitating the implementation and monitoring of these metacognitive skills. Now, I mentioned the Padlet. I've seen how many people have contributed, and thank you. There are lots of questions for Dr. Folkestad, and I'm going to suggest that if it's okay, just so we keep to our schedule in deference to everybody, that we're going to respond to your questions asynchronously, and then give you sort of follow-up insights to your questions. So your questions in the Padlet are duly noted, and then we also have our facilitators from the discussion group. So we're going to put all that together and send it to you. And follow up, we will have the summary. We also will have shortly a survey, and I urge you, as always, to please fill this out. I'm endeavoring for a majority, if not complete, participation. Think of how much you want your students to fill out their course evaluations. Well, this is my course evaluation, and just so Lecturio continues to host this for us, please respond. Certificates of attendance will be mailed out for all those, emailed to all those who want them, and as I alluded to, a summary document of these key strategies. I want to mention that the next seminar, Metacognition, really wraps up our cognitive science component of our durable learning series. And so we're next going to launch into the principles of instructional design.
I'm sorry, Peter, I just accidentally muted you. I'm very sorry.
There we go. I'm back. I don't know how much you missed. Was I talking to myself for a long time? It happens sometimes.
No, just 2 seconds.
Peter, no worries.
Good, thank you. So I was just going to say our future events, we're going to focus on instructional design, how best to optimize the learning process, and that'll give us an opportunity to apply these metacognitive processes. And always want to put in a plug for the research endeavors that our team orchestrates. We have several schools now participating in active research with us. So I want to really thank Dr. Folkestad. I think you could see that he added a whole new live dimension to the applications of metacognition. When I heard him talk about you behavior, this was kind of an aha moment. And it's sharing things like this to all of you globally. You know, these problems are present all over the world, and we can really put this, you know, these practices and start changing behavior and optimizing how we learn for more durable learning. So that concludes, we're at the hour, and that concludes the session. Thanks for the whole team.